Andrew Caldwell sat at the head of a long, glossy conference table, his eyes locked on the projected numbers. The quarterly revenue was slightly down, and it showed on his stern face. "This is unacceptable," he said, his voice clipped and demanding, cutting through the silence of the boardroom. Executives around him fidgeted, but Andrew's focus was unwavering. He was used to commanding the room, no one dared challenge his authority. Suddenly, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He ignored it at first, but it buzzed insistently. With a flash of irritation, he pulled it out. His expression changed when he saw the caller ID, City Hospital. Andrew felt his chest tighten, memories of his wife's fatal accident flooding his mind. His hand trembled slightly as he answered, his voice low. Moments later, his face went pale. The past collided with the present, a haunting reminder of the fragility he had worked so hard to forget. The next thing Andrew knew, he was the one in a hospital bed. It had happened in an instant, a reckless driver, a sudden swerve, and darkness. He woke up in a sterile room, tubes and wires tangled around him, his body feeling heavy and foreign. Panic settled in as he tried to move his legs, only to find them numb. A wave of vulnerability washed over him, a feeling he despised. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. In walked a woman in her late 20s, with auburn hair tied in a neat ponytail and kind eyes that seemed to hold secrets of their own. "Mr. Caldwell?" she asked gently. "I'm Olivia Parker, your caregiver." Andrew's eyes narrowed as he sized her up. "I don't need a caregiver," he said gruffly, his voice raw from disuse. But Olivia merely smiled, a warm, patient smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm afraid it's doctor's orders. You'll need help during your recovery." Andrew's first reaction was to dismiss her, but something about her unwavering calm made him pause. It was clear that Olivia was accustomed to dealing with difficult patients, and she wasn't going to be easily intimidated. She began by explaining his rehabilitation process in detail, and Andrew's resistance was met with a level-headed firmness. As Olivia settled into her role, Andrew struggled against the constraints of both his physical limitations and the idea of having someone see him so helpless. It was a new kind of battle for him, one he wasn't used to losing. But beneath the irritation, there was something else, a flicker of recognition in Olivia's eyes, as if she understood a pain similar to his own. The first few days were filled with terse words and awkward silences. Olivia's steady presence was both a relief and a constant reminder of his current weakness. For someone who prided himself on control, the lack of it was infuriating. Every task required assistance, every movement was a reminder of his dependence. Despite Andrew's resistance, Olivia remained professional. But there was a moment, late one evening, when she caught him staring out of the window, lost in thought. "It's okay to feel angry," she said quietly. Andrew's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Her words lingered in the air, cutting through the room's tension. That night, as Andrew tried to sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that Olivia's presence was both a disruption and a lifeline. Andrew's resistance remained steadfast over the following days. Each attempt to move on his own ended in failure, and his frustration was palpable. His temper flared during the physical therapy sessions, where he often snapped at Olivia. "I don't need help," he grunted, trying to push himself up from the wheelchair but ultimately collapsing back with a painful grimace. Olivia's expression didn't falter. She remained unrelenting yet gentle, guiding him through each exercise with a calm persistence. Her hands were steady as she adjusted his posture, and Andrew found himself begrudgingly admiring her patience. She noticed his resistance wasn't just physical. It was deeply emotional, rooted in his unwillingness to show vulnerability. One evening, after a particularly difficult session, Andrew was unusually quiet. Olivia observed him closely, noting how he avoided her gaze. "It's okay to be angry," she said, breaking the silence. "This isn't easy." Andrew's jaw tightened, and he looked away, his voice low and laced with bitterness. "You wouldn't understand. You've never lost everything in an instant." Olivia paused, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Then she took a deep breath and spoke quietly, but with a raw honesty that Andrew hadn't heard before. "I might understand more than you think. My brother was sick for years. There were days when it felt like the world was falling apart and I was powerless to stop it." Andrew's eyes flickered with surprise. Her story felt strangely personal, a vulnerability that matched his own. For the first time, he saw a deeper side of Olivia, one that mirrored his own pain, but expressed with resilience rather than anger. "Is that why you do this?" Andrew asked, his voice softer. "Why you became a nurse?" Olivia nodded, her eyes distant as she recalled the past. "Yes. I wanted to make a difference, even if it was just for one person at a time. I thought maybe if I could help someone else, it would matter somehow. The conversation created a fragile bond between them, one that was difficult for Andrew to ignore. He felt a strange comfort in knowing that Olivia understood more than he realized. The days that followed were marked by a slight shift in their interactions. Andrew still struggled with his independence, but he allowed Olivia to help him more willingly. One morning, as Olivia adjusted the straps on Andrew's wheelchair, she caught him studying her intently. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. "You're different," he said, almost to himself. "Most people back off when I push them away. But you keep coming back." Olivia smiled, a soft warmth in her eyes. "I've learned that the toughest people often need the most help, even if they don't want to admit it." Andrew's chest tightened, a mix of gratitude and confusion welling up inside him. It wasn't just the physical help he needed, it was the emotional support he hadn't realized he'd been craving. And Olivia, with her steady hands and quiet words, was starting to fill that void in ways he hadn't expected. As the days unfolded, a more familiar rhythm settled between Andrew and Olivia. Their interactions, once filled with resistance and coldness, now carried hints of warmth and understanding. It was as if Andrew's walls, meticulously built over years of isolation, were beginning to crumble, slowly but unmistakably. The daily therapy sessions became less of a burden for Andrew. While the exercises were still painful, there was now a sense of purpose behind each movement. Olivia's voice was a constant source of encouragement. "You're doing well," she'd say, her tone genuine as she guided him through each painful stretch. Andrew found himself focusing not just on his physical progress, but on the way Olivia's presence seemed to fill the sterile room with a comforting energy. One rainy afternoon, as the sound of raindrops echoed softly against the window, Olivia arrived with a small surprise, an old vinyl record. She placed it on the turntable that had been gathering dust in Andrew's study, filling the room with soft jazz. It was a sound that carried memories of a happier past for Andrew, but it was also unexpectedly soothing. "I thought it might help," Olivia explained, a hopeful smile tugging at her lips. Andrew raised an eyebrow, both intrigued and surprised. "You brought this for me?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Olivia nodded. "Music has a way of healing too," she replied. "I figured it couldn't hurt to try." The unexpected gesture caught Andrew off guard, stirring a sense of gratitude he hadn't felt in years. He watched Olivia as she swayed slightly to the music, her eyes closed momentarily. For a moment, the harsh realities of his situation faded, replaced by a sense of tranquility. In that moment, Andrew felt a shift within himself, a longing not just for physical recovery but for something more, something real. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice almost lost in the music. Olivia's eyes met his, and there was a softness there that made Andrew's heart ache in a new, unfamiliar way. It wasn't just attraction, it was connection. But as soon as the moment grew too intense, Andrew looked away, uncomfortable with the vulnerability he felt. The next morning, as Olivia wheeled Andrew outside for some fresh air, he found himself speaking more openly. "I haven't been out here in a long time," he admitted, his voice filled with a mix of regret and nostalgia. "My wife, she loved this garden." Olivia's expression softened, but she didn't press him for details. Instead, she simply listened, allowing the conversation to unfold naturally. "It's a beautiful place," she said, her voice gentle. "I can see why she loved it." The vulnerability in Andrew's eyes was unmistakable. "It was our favorite spot," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "But after she died, I couldn't bring myself to come out here alone." Olivia reached out, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone anymore, Andrew," she said softly, her words filled with sincerity. Andrew looked up at her, the weight of her words settling deep within him. It was a simple statement, but it carried a profound impact. He realized then that Olivia wasn't just his caregiver, she was becoming someone he could trust, someone who saw him for who he truly was. The rest of the day passed quietly but with a new sense of closeness. As Andrew lay in bed that night, he couldn't help but think of Olivia's words. They were a lifeline, pulling him toward a future that suddenly felt less daunting and more hopeful. The closeness between Andrew and Olivia had grown into something undeniable. Small gestures of affection, like the way Andrew's gaze lingered when Olivia wasn't looking, or the way Olivia's touch became more gentle during his exercises, hinted at feelings that neither of them dared to speak aloud. But beneath this intimacy, Olivia sensed that Andrew was still hiding something, a part of himself that remained closed off. One afternoon, while organizing Andrew's study, Olivia stumbled upon a folder on his desk labeled Urgent, Private. It was partially open, revealing documents related to a planned acquisition. Olivia hesitated, her conscience battling her curiosity, but a nagging feeling told her she needed to know more. She skimmed through the documents, her heart sinking as she read the details. The acquisition involved major layoffs. Thousands of employees were at risk of losing their jobs. Olivia felt a surge of disappointment and disbelief. She had started to believe in Andrew's capacity for change, but these papers painted a different picture. Andrew wheeled into the room just as Olivia put the folder back down, her face pale and her eyes filled with a mix of hurt and betrayal. He immediately noticed her change in demeanor. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. Olivia looked at him, her eyes filled with a combination of anger and sadness. "I saw the documents," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Are you really planning to go through with this deal, even if it means destroying so many lives?" Andrew's face hardened. His initial reaction was defensive, the walls he had begun to lower coming back up in an instant. "That's none of your business," he snapped, his voice cold and distant. "You shouldn't have been looking through my things." Olivia's eyes flashed with frustration, her voice rising. "I didn't mean to invade your privacy, Andrew. But what I found, it goes against everything you've been showing me these past few weeks. I thought you were different." Andrew felt a surge of anger mixed with guilt. He hated the vulnerability that Olivia brought out in him, and he hated even more that she was right. "You don't understand how business works," he insisted, his tone harsh. "This isn't about hurting people, it's about keeping the company afloat." Olivia shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "But it is about people, Andrew. You can't just ignore the consequences of your actions. If you choose profit over people, then what was the point of all this? Of letting me in?" The words hit Andrew harder than he expected. Deep down, he knew Olivia was speaking the truth. He had allowed himself to care about her, and in doing so, he had to confront the darker parts of himself, the parts that had justified ruthless decisions for the sake of success. But his pride was a formidable barrier, one that refused to let him fully admit his mistakes. "You think you know me," he said bitterly. "But you don't know what it takes to keep a business like this running?" Olivia's voice broke. "I thought I did know you, Andrew. I thought you were someone who wanted to change. But maybe I was wrong." Without waiting for a response, Olivia turned and walked out of the room, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. Andrew watched her leave, a hollow feeling settling in his chest. For the first time in years he felt truly alone, not just in his home but in the path he had chosen. That night as he lay in bed, Andrew couldn't escape the weight of Olivia's words. He knew that if he continued down this path, he risked losing not just her, but the part of himself that had started to care again. The days after Olivia's departure were colder, not just in temperature but in Andrew's soul. He tried to immerse himself in work, yet every room in his house felt emptier without Olivia's warmth. The garden, once a place of peace, now seemed dull and lifeless. Her words haunted him. "If you choose profit over people, then what was the point of all this?" Andrew felt a pang of regret every time he thought of her, but he was torn between the man he was and the man he wanted to become. As he sifted through documents on his desk one evening, he noticed Olivia's letter lying among the papers, a stark reminder of the decision he had to make. "Andrew, I never meant to overstep my boundaries, but I can't support decisions that hurt people. I thought you were changing, maybe even for me as much as for yourself. But this deal, it's not something I can stand by. I wish you the best, but I have to stay true to my beliefs. Olivia." Andrew's chest tightened as he read the letter. He knew she was right, and it wasn't just about the business, it was about everything he'd become since his wife's death. He had let the pain harden him, using business as a shield against feeling anything at all. But Olivia had shattered that shield, forcing him to face his own choices. Determined to change, Andrew called a meeting with his board of directors the following morning. His decision was clear and unyielding. The acquisition would be restructured to prevent the layoffs, even if it meant sacrificing part of the company's profit. The board members were stunned, but Andrew's resolve was stronger than ever. "People are the heart of this company," he said, his voice steady. "And we've lost sight of that. It's time to remember why we started this in the first place." The board's reaction was mixed. Some were supportive, others skeptical, but Andrew felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. It was a gamble, but it was one he knew he had to take, not just to save the company but to save himself. With the decision made, Andrew reached out to Olivia. He left her a message. "Olivia, I know I've made mistakes, but I'm trying to fix them. I'd like to talk if you're willing to listen." Olivia, still hurt and conflicted, hesitated at first. She had tried to move on, focusing on her work, But Andrew's message stirred something inside her. An unfinished story, perhaps a second chance. She agreed to meet him, if only to understand his true intentions. They met at a small cafe, a neutral and quiet place. Andrew wheeled himself in, still recovering, but his posture was different. Less guarded, more vulnerable. Olivia's heart softened at the sight, but she kept her voice steady. "You wanted to talk," she said, her eyes searching his. Andrew took a deep breath. "I pulled back from the acquisition," he confessed. "No layoffs. I couldn't live with myself knowing the damage it would cause, especially after everything you made me see." Olivia's eyes widened, a mix of relief and disbelief. "You really did that?" "Yes," he said simply, his voice sincere. "Because I realized you were right. It wasn't just about the business, it was about becoming someone I could be proud of, someone you could believe in." Tears welled up in Olivia's eyes, but she held back. "It's not easy to change," she whispered. "But you're trying. And that's what matters." Andrew's gaze softened, filled with hope. "I don't know where this leads, Olivia," he admitted. "But I know I want to try, with you." Olivia reached out, taking his hand gently. "We'll figure it out," she said, her voice filled with a mix of caution and possibility. Together. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was real. For the first time, there was no pretense, no barriers, just two people willing to start anew. With the decision about the acquisition behind him, Andrew felt a new sense of clarity, one driven not just by the desire to fix his mistakes, but by the hope of rebuilding trust with Olivia. He was still uncertain about what the future held, but he was determined to face it step by step. Olivia continued to visit, agreeing to resume her role as his caregiver, but it was different now. There was a sense of renewal in the air, a cautious hope that lingered between them. Their interactions carried a new tenderness, small touches, lingering glances, and moments of quiet understanding. It was a relationship that was slowly mending, shaped by sincerity rather than regret. One crisp afternoon, Andrew asked Olivia to take him back to the garden. It was a place that had symbolized loss for so long, but now, with Olivia beside him, it felt like a place of promise. The blooming flowers, the soft hum of bees, and the distant chirping of birds filled the air. It was a peaceful silence, one that spoke more than words ever could. "Thank you," Andrew said quietly, breaking the silence. His voice was soft but filled with emotion. "For giving me another chance." Olivia smiled gently. "You earned it, Andrew. You showed me that you were willing to change, not just for me but for yourself." Andrew's eyes reflected a mix of gratitude and vulnerability. "I never thought I'd be capable of this kind of change," he admitted. "But you made me see what I was missing. You reminded me of who I could be." The sincerity of his words touched Olivia deeply. She reached out, taking his hand in hers, and there was no hesitation this time, just a simple acceptance of what had always been between them. "It's not just about what you lost, Andrew," she said softly. "It's about what you can gain if you're willing to keep trying." Andrew squeezed her hand gently, his voice filled with determination. I want to try with you." That evening, as a gesture of newfound affection, Andrew arranged a candlelit dinner on the terrace overlooking the city skyline. It wasn't extravagant, but it was thoughtful, filled with personal touches that spoke volumes. The soft glow of the candles cast a warm light on Olivia's face, and Andrew couldn't help but marvel at how far they had come. "You did all this?" Olivia asked, her eyes bright with surprise and joy. Andrew nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I wanted to do something special. I know I still have a lot to prove, but I wanted you to know how much you mean to me." Olivia's heart swelled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's perfect," she whispered. As they shared a simple meal, the conversation flowed easily, filled with laughter and genuine connection. The wounds of the past seemed distant now, replaced by the hope of a future they were both willing to embrace. As the evening drew to a close, Andrew reached out, taking Olivia's hand again. "I know I've made mistakes," he said quietly, "but I want to keep trying. I want to build something real, something worth fighting for." Olivia's response was simple but filled with emotion. "And I want to build it with you." Their lips met in a tender, lingering kiss, a promise of redemption, love, and a new beginning. It was a kiss that wasn't just about passion, but about the journey they had taken to find each other. It was a kiss filled with everything that had been unspoken and everything that was yet to be discovered. For the first time, Andrew felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that he wasn't alone anymore. As he looked into Olivia's eyes, he saw a reflection of the future he had once thought impossible. One filled with love, understanding, and a commitment to grow together. The night was quiet, with only the distant hum of the city below, But it was a quiet filled with hope, a quiet that promised a new chapter, one they would write together.